So, here's a question. What would you say is your favorite horror movie?
My favorite horror movie. That is a good question. I'm gonna have to go all the way back to Psycho, just because of the way they, Hitchcock played with everything. He leads you down one path, and all of a sudden he pulls you off that path in the middle of the movie, and then it becomes a detective movie. And then at the very end, not wanting to give it away to the one or two people who've never seen Psycho.
Like me, believe it or not.
You've never seen Psycho?
No, keep meaning to. I haven't gotten around to it.
Okay. But I've had the pleasure of sitting next to two people who didn't know how Psycho ended, watching them as opposed to watching the movie.
Nice.
Which is Psycho is loosely based on a serial killer named Ed Gein.
Yes, I'm familiar with Gein. He's the basis of a lot of things. Although, doesn't he not technically qualify as a serial killer because he only killed 2 people?
Yeah.
Something like that. But one thing the community did that after his death, I thought was great, is that when they noticed that his house was in danger of becoming a tourist spot for the morbidly curious, they went ahead and burned it down. They didn't want the morbid people coming around just saying, "Oh, that's where such and such happened." They put an end to that by burning the house down.
I can imagine how much trouble they'd just anything with that kind of reputation. The house where murders took place, house that's supposed to be haunted, the look you lose.
Yeah.
Not something I've ever felt the inclination to do personally. It's like, no, I don't need to go see where this happened.
You don't want to stay in the Lizzie Borden house?
Okay, yes, I would, but in fairness, that's a bed and breakfast they're actually renting out.
Well, yeah, they made it profitable.
And also, I'd want to go and investigate this Lizzie Borden house.
Yeah, it's the same thing if people take trips over to Eastern Europe to stay in Dracula's castle.
The funny part being that it's not actually Dracula's castle.
Right. Actually, and there's a book, I forget who wrote it, but it's called In Search of Dracula.
Raymond McNally and Radu T. Florescu.
Right. And in the book, they mention the fact that once they found out where Vlad Tepes' grave was and opened it up, his body wasn't there.
Yep.
Correct me if I'm wrong, we still don't know where that is.
They had a theory.
It was buried off to the side because they figured people might desecrate the grave, and they wanted them to desecrate an empty grave.
Well, here's the thing, though. They never actually found the body. I actually, way back in the day when I did the radio show I used to do, we had Raymond McNally on the show. His theory at circa the early 2000s was that, for that reason, basically Dracula was actually buried underneath where they dug. They just had to keep going. He was actually a lot of fun to interview.
Okay. Speaking of that, I can tell you a story about something that happened to me on a crime scene. A woman sends her dog out to do what dogs do at night, and he comes back with a huge bone in his mouth. And the woman is concerned that the bone was human, so she calls the police. The police come, They find where the dog was digging, and they do see some bones. They, according to procedure, they held it off until, member of the crime scene unit could come out and photograph it before they start digging.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the crime scene tech going out, so I photographed it, and they started digging, and they found the bones of a dog. Somebody's dog had died, and they, buried it in a shallow grave. And of course, I have to say something like, well, if it were me and I were trying to hide a human body, I'd put a dog on top of it so you guys would stop looking.
It makes sense.
Yeah, they all kind of gave me a strange look. Asked me if this were a plot of an upcoming story, and then they dug down far enough until they said, "Satisfied, John?" And I said, "If you are, I am."
So I'm assuming there was no human body beneath?
No, but it would have made a much better story if it had been.
Well, there's another story my mentor, the late Lou Gentili, had out of Maryland, where family buys this plot of land to build a house on. The dad's a contractor. As you know, I'm sure, John, in many parts of Maryland, and this is no exception, the water's table's too high to build a proper basement.
Right.
So they build the house, they move in, and one day Ma decides she wants to dig herself a garden. First thing that comes out of the ground is a brass handle. The second thing to come out of the ground is a human femur bone. Turns out the people who they bought the property from bulldozed the tombstones, left the bodies. That was late 90s, I want to say.
Yeah. Quite a few years ago, we had a case where in a very small local cemetery, the gravedigger is, preparing a grave for, a recently deceased, and he runs across an already buried body there in the supposedly empty plot. That caused a bit of, consternation. But after they had, again, called the crime lab, we photographed it and all that, they dug down deeper, and it turned out to have been a body that had been buried a long time ago that had just never been properly position had never been properly recorded.
Well, better than the alternative, certainly.
Yes.
Okay, since we're kind of headed in that direction anyway, why don't we talk a little bit about your work other than writing?
Sure.
So how long have you been working crime in the crime lab?
In April of this year, it'll be 39 years.
What got you started?
I didn't get into medical school. When I had plans to be, to go to medical school, become a doctor and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And for whatever reason, I wasn't accepted. And when I started looking around for a job, a friend of my father's who worked in the police department, he said, the crime lab hires civilians. And it turned out that the Baltimore City Police Department was one of the few jurisdictions in the country that hired civilians not just for inside lab jobs, but for crime scene jobs. Donald Pomerleau was the commissioner, and his view was, if you're not patrolling, investigating, or arresting people, you don't need to be a police officer to do the job. So he was one of the first to actually put civilian personnel on the street.
Makes sense.
And once we established that, we knew what we were doing and we were good at it, police began to accept us. Which, if you know anything about the police culture, for civilians to be accepted into that culture, you have to really know what the hell you're doing. And since then, a lot of jurisdictions, at least in the Baltimore in Maryland, are hire civilian personnel for their crime scene duties. Unlike those TV shows you see.
So, aside from the dog bones, what was the most interesting story you'd want to tell?
There's a lot of interesting stories. Most of them aren't. Most of them involve burglaries, because that's where the mystery fan in me gets to have some fun, where you actually get to play Sherlock Holmes and solve locked room, or in this case, locked house mysteries. Somebody breaks in, robs the house, leaves, but you can't figure out how he managed to get in. All the doors are, all the windows are shut, all the doors are locked. How did this guy get in? And we found things like he was able to, the way the mail slot was built, he was able to reach in through the mail slot and unlock the door. It was an apartment, and they managed to get into the crawl space behind the that ran alongside the apartment, come in through the closet, and then just pile stuff in front of the closet. There was one old movie theater where nobody knew there was a door behind the movie screen. So they were, about once a week, somebody would come in through this door that nobody knew about, because it was in an alley, and eventually somebody said, "Hey, where does this, let's do a walk around the outside." They said, "Well, where does this door go?" And they let it, then they found out, and they secured the door. But I can't go into too many details for obvious reasons. But like every city, Baltimore has had has had serial killers. They've had people who commit very violent home invasions. So I guess you could call them serial killers. So those are the interesting cases, when you can work on, or serial rapists, when you can work on one of them, and you're instrumental in getting the evidence that puts these truly bad people, in jail for a very long time. It gives you a very good feeling.
I don't doubt that. It's just interesting to think about, because whenever you think about true crime shows and things like that, everybody just usually jumps right to the murder. But certainly, what you're talking about with the burglary, there's some interesting stuff there. It makes me think there's an untapped potential.
Not to mention, it's not as... It's a little bit later.
Yeah, it's not as dramatic as murder. There was I can't remember the title, but there was one mystery anthology. I wasn't writing at the time, but the theme was you could have any crime in there except murder. And I think those are the challenging stories. I wrote one for a Padwolf collection called Fantastic Futures 13, which is a caper novel set in a future in which you can still commit crime. It's just very hard to get away with it. And I actually had to include a bibliography, because I had sources from Discover Magazine and Popular Science and all that.
Nice.
Oh, wow. A sci-fi caper novel that makes you do your homework. I approve.
Right.
Oh. And yeah, I've seen a couple of stories that deal with, there's so many other things out there aside from going with the obvious, somebody got murdered in a weird way, how did that happen? But it isn't done as often, certainly in television and movies. When you think of the big stuff, the big ones, it's always the murders and the serial killers. Which I can certainly understand. I mean, I've done articles and things like that about serial killers, because it certainly, aspects of some of them overlap quite heavily with my work. as a demonologist, because when you look at some of the larger ones like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, there was an interest in black magic and in Satanism and things of that nature. But it's like there are other things out there that are worth writing about and worth talking about from a crime perspective instead of always the blood and gore.
Yeah, and from our point of view, one of the things that we teach, one of the first things we teach incoming technicians, is that the most important crime you can process is whatever crime you're working on then. If you read fiction and all that, people concentrate on the murders, the shootings, the assaults. But when somebody feels, lives in the house, they feel safe, and suddenly somebody breaks in and steals their stuff, and they steal more than television and money and laptops. They steal a person's peace of mind. And by going after these kind of criminals, you're helping. You're also helping restore a person's sense of security.
You got a really good point there, and it's I think something people don't think about.
I think we need to take that line and use that as the tagline for the video.
I think so. I'll talk to I'll have Amisha set it aside so I can do that. My editor is also my fiance, so it's easier to do these things. But yeah, I agree, Drew. That's an excellent tagline for the video. How are we doing on time, Drew? How long have we been at this?
So far, it's been 48 minutes. So, we did have about a 5-minute pause.
Yeah.
So, we're probably good as far as material, because we're going to have to cut some stuff out.
Yeah, mostly the breaks and things, and this here, obviously.
Yeah, mostly just people tend not to watch things that are too long.
Yeah. I think interviews are a little better, although we're fighting again because of the fact we're mostly audio.
Mm-hmm.
So we probably should wrap it up soon.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
You have any more questions for John?
No, pretty much everything I was going to ask has already been answered.
Okay. John, do you have anything you're curious about? You want to ask us?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Well, okay, folks. I think we're going to wrap this up. Well, actually, no, I will put in one last thing, because certainly you're an author with books out and coming out. John, is there anything coming up for certain in the near future you want to give a plug for?
Let me plug a book that Padwolf Publishers just put out. It's The Nightmare Strikes. The Nightmare is one of my takes on the Shadow. Pat Thomas has described him as the Shadow if played by Brendan Fraser. And the Nightmare not only goes after your traditional pulp villains, he's also the one in that era who goes after the supernatural menaces that the Shadow and the Spider don't. He goes after a zombie hitman. He deals with the aftermath of the fall of a certain large ape. He actually teams up with Bianca Jones, which is interesting because he's in the 1920s and 30s and she's in the 21st century. And at the end, he teams up with a phoenix.
Am I right?
To save New York.
About that book, didn't he show up in a collection you did with Patrick Thomas at some point?
Right. He showed his first appearances were in From the Shadows, in which he teams up with Pat Thomas's The Pink Reaper and Nemesis, Goddess of Vengeance.
Yeah, I have to say for our listeners, I have read the stories in that book. I've read a number of other of John L. French's books. I highly recommend you check them out. Very talented writer, a lot of good takes and stuff. John, I want to thank you for coming on. You've been a great guest.
Yeah, thank you.
Um,
Thank you for inviting me.
Been a pleasure.
have a good evening, everyone. And for that's it for tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. To give you a quick look at what's coming up ahead, we've got a bunch of new interviews lined up. We have one with Omnimancer Arthur Moyer that's filmed. We're working on editing it. We've got one with Lilith Lore, who's a wonderful woman who does her own takes on fairy tales. We'll be scheduling that probably next week or so. We've got one with, as I said earlier in this episode, Patrick Thomas, another fantastic author. We also have the interviews that you'll see when we put up the Arthur interview. We've got interviews coming up with Professor Mark Donnelly about torture and cannibalism. We've got interviews with the musician Voltaire. Some point in the near future, that will probably be further down the line. We're just currently in the process of sorting out scheduling for these folks, but they are going to be coming up, so please tune in. I'm Kevin Mears for the Paranormal Encyclopedia. Drew, you want to say goodnight?
Yep, I'm Drew Rosansky, and it has been a pleasure. Thank you again, John.
You're welcome. Good night, everybody.
Good night.